Did medieval women truly ride broomsticks under a full moon, plotting dark spells? Were millions burned at the stake for imagined pacts with evil? Uncover the astonishing truth about witchcraft in medieval women, often painted with broad, inaccurate strokes from the 12th to the 15th centuries. Number 8. The Malleus Maleficarum witch's hammer was widely used and authoritative throughout the medieval period. Many people think of the Malleus Maleficarum, often called the Witch's Hammer, as the ultimate guide for hunting witches, a book that every judge and inquisitor used to condemn women across Europe for centuries. This book is certainly famous, or perhaps infamous, but its story is far more complicated and less universally dominant than popular belief suggests. The Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1486. This date is important. The medieval period typically stretches from the 5th century to the late 15th century. So, this book appeared right at the very end of the medieval era, practically on the cusp of what historians call the early modern period. This timing alone tells us it could not have been a universal guide for the entire medieval period. The authors of this book were Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. They were Dominican inquisitors, and they believed their work was vital for rooting out what they saw as a growing threat of witchcraft. The book detailed theories about witchcraft, how to identify witches, and how to conduct trials. It certainly contained some very grim ideas, including strong beliefs about the supposed weakness of women, making them more susceptible to the devil's influence. But even in its own time, the Malleus faced skepticism and resistance. For instance, the book claimed to have received an endorsement from the theological faculty of the University of Cologne. This was meant to give it a stamp of intellectual approval, a seal of authority from a respected academic institution. However, historical research has revealed that the University of Cologne's faculty later denied giving any such endorsement. They stated that the signatures on the original document were forged or obtained under false pretenses. This suggests that even powerful scholars at the time were not universally convinced by Kramer and Sprenger's radical views or their methods. Different legal systems across Europe also had diverse ways of dealing with accusations of magic. In England, for example, the legal system was based on common law, which relied on juries and specific legal precedents. English courts did not adopt the inquisitorial procedures that the Malleus promoted, which involved extensive torture and a heavy reliance on confessions. Instead, English trials for witchcraft, when they did happen, often followed different rules, focused on proving specific acts of harm, and usually resulted in hanging rather than burning. The Malleus Maleficarum, therefore, had very limited influence in places like England or Ireland. On the European continent, where inquisitorial courts were more common, the Malleus did gain some traction, especially in Germanic regions, but even there, its use was not uniform or immediate. Many local judges and legal scholars preferred to rely on existing legal traditions or Roman law principles rather than fully embrace the extreme views presented in the Malleus. The legal historian Edward Peters noted in his work on medieval law that while the Malleus gained popularity, it was not the sole or primary legal text consulted by jurists. Many lawyers and judges simply ignored it, finding its arguments convoluted or its procedures unworkable within their existing legal frameworks. Consider the views of other prominent figures. Jean Bodin, a French jurist and demonologist writing slightly later in the 16th century, had his own strong opinions on witchcraft in his book De la démonomanie des sorciers. While Bodin was certainly a fervent believer in witchcraft, his work sometimes diverged from the specific theories and procedures laid out in the Malleus. This shows that even among those who believed in the reality of witchcraft, there was no single, universally agreed upon textbook or legal manual. The Malleus Maleficarum was a product of its time, reflecting anxieties and emerging theological ideas at the close of the 15th century. Its influence grew significantly after the medieval period, during the 16th and 17th centuries, when the witch hunts reached their terrifying peak. It became a handbook for some, particularly in regions where accusations were rampant and legal systems were more open to its severe recommendations. But to claim it was widely used and authoritative throughout the entire medieval period, guiding the hands of every judge and shaping every trial, simply does not align with the historical evidence. Its delayed and geographically varied reception highlights the complexity of legal and religious thought in the past. Historian Joseph Hansen's Quellen und Untersuchungen zur Geschichte des Hexenwahns und der Hexenverfolgung im Mittelalter documents many different medieval approaches to magic, showing the Malleus was but one among many. Number 7. Accused witches confess due to genuine supernatural powers. The chilling confessions of individuals accused of witchcraft, detailing secret meetings with the devil, flying through the air, and causing harm through dark rituals might seem to suggest some genuine supernatural activity at play. But dig deeper into the historical records, and a far more human, and often tragic, explanation comes to light. Accused witches confessed not because they possessed actual magical abilities, but because of intense, overwhelming pressure, often including brutal torture. Torture was a common practice in many European legal systems during the late medieval and early modern periods, particularly in inquisitorial courts. The goal of torture was to extract a confession, which was considered the queen of proofs. Without a confession, it was often difficult to secure a conviction, even if other evidence was presented. So, once an individual was accused, the pressure to confess was immense, and the methods used were designed to break even the strongest will. Consider the range of torture methods employed. The strappado involved tying a person's hands behind their back and hoisting them into the air by a rope attached to their wrists, often with weights tied to their feet. This would dislocate shoulders and cause excruciating pain. The rack stretched a person's body until their joints were dislocated. Thumbscrews crushed fingers and toes. Sleep deprivation was a common tactic, sometimes for days on end, driving people to hallucinations and a desperate need for rest. Starvation and prolonged solitary confinement also weakened individuals both physically and mentally. Under such horrific conditions, people would confess to anything, even the most fantastical and impossible acts, simply to make the pain stop. An innocent person, faced with the prospect of endless torment, would rather invent a detailed story of diabolical pacts and magical gatherings than endure further agony. The aim was survival, not truth. These confessions, once extracted, were then used against the accused, even if they later tried to recant them. A recantation was often seen as evidence of the devil's influence, or a sign that the accused was trying to deceive the court, sometimes leading to even more severe torture. A famous example from the 17th century, though slightly after the strict medieval period, is the case of Isobel Gowdy in Scotland. In 1662, she gave incredibly detailed and imaginative confessions, describing precise forms of shapeshifting into a cat or a crow, attending meetings with the devil, and even detailing specific methods of bewitching people. While some at the time believed her confessions proved the reality of witchcraft, modern historians and psychologists often cite her case as a prime example of elaborate fantasies induced by torture, extreme stress, and perhaps a desire to please her interrogators by providing the vivid details they seemed to seek. Beyond physical torture, there was immense psychological and social pressure. An individual accused of witchcraft would often find themselves completely isolated. Neighbors, friends, and even family members might turn against them, driven by fear, superstition, or existing grudges. The very act of accusation could strip a person of their standing in the community, leaving them vulnerable and alone. Faced with such societal condemnation and the terrifying authority of the court, a person might genuinely start to doubt themselves or feel that confession was their only way out, even if it meant certain death. The work of historian Christina Larner, especially in Enemies of God: The Witch Hunt in England, highlights how social pressures and fear of supernatural malevolence shaped these confessions. Sometimes individuals suffered from mental illness or severe senility. Their rambling, confused statements could be misinterpreted by interrogators as signs of a demonic pact or genuine magical knowledge. What might today be recognized as symptoms of dementia or psychosis were then seen as evidence of direct communication with evil forces. The beliefs of the accusers themselves also played a critical role. If a community firmly believed in the devil and his power and in the ability of witches to work evil, then any strange behavior or misfortune could be attributed to witchcraft. This shared belief system could influence how confessions were interpreted, and sometimes even how an accused individual perceived their own experience. Consider the trials in Salem, Massachusetts, in the late 17th century. Many of the accused, including young women and men, eventually confessed, detailing strange experiences and encounters with the devil. These confessions were often obtained during intense interrogations, where the accused were urged by ministers and magistrates to give glory to God by confessing their sins. Many later recanted their confessions, explaining that they had confessed only to escape the immediate threat of execution, as those who confessed were often spared the gallows, while those who maintained their innocence were typically condemned. This pattern suggests that confessions were strategic acts of survival rather than revelations of true occult power. A judicial record from 1390 in Paris describes a woman, Jeanne de Brigue, who, after several days of severe interrogation and threats to her family, confessed to attending nighttime gatherings with others who engaged in strange rituals. Her confession, though detailed, emerged only after significant duress, suggesting the details were provided to satisfy her interrogators rather than reflecting an actual existing witch cult. The study of legal procedures in crime and punishment in the Middle Ages by William Chester Jordan confirms that the purpose of torture was solely to obtain a confession. Thus, the idea that these confessions were rooted in genuine supernatural powers fades away when the brutal realities of the interrogation chamber are exposed. Number 6. Witch hunts were primarily driven by misogyny. The image of women as the primary targets of witch hunts, particularly old, solitary women, certainly suggests that misogyny played a significant role. It is undeniable that a disproportionate number of those accused and executed for witchcraft were women, often around 75 to 80% in many regions of Europe. However, saying that misogyny was the sole or primary driving force behind the witch hunts simplifies a far more complex historical phenomenon. And witch hunts were driven by a tangled web of factors, including economic anxieties, social tensions, religious fervor, and political instability. Economic anxieties were a powerful force. When harvests failed, livestock died, or sickness spread through a community, people desperately sought explanations and someone to blame. Witchcraft offered a convenient scapegoat. An old woman who had a reputation for grumbling, or a local healer whose remedies failed, might become the target of accusations when misfortune struck. These accusations were often rooted in long-standing neighborly disputes over property, debts, or personal slights. A cow's unexpected death might lead to a quick accusation against a difficult neighbor, regardless of their gender. The insights from Emmanuel Leroy-Ladury's Montego the Promised Land of Error show how village life was fraught with suspicion and how misfortunes were often attributed to dark forces. Social tensions were also key. Communities in the medieval and early modern periods were often tightly knit, but also prone to internal conflict. Their fear of outsiders, social deviants, or anyone who did not conform to community norms could lead to accusations. While women who challenged traditional roles or were seen as too independent might be targeted, so too could men who were perceived as troublesome or unorthodox. Some accusations against women stemmed from a fear of their traditional roles as healers or midwives, particularly when treatments failed, or when new medical ideas began to clash with older folk practices. Religious fervor, especially during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, intensified fears of the devil and his earthly agents. Both Catholics and Protestants, locked in bitter theological disputes, saw the world as a battleground between good and evil. This heightened sense of spiritual warfare made people more susceptible to believing in a widespread satanic conspiracy. The devil was seen as actively recruiting followers, and those accused of witchcraft were believed to be his willing servants. This religious zeal often overshadowed simple gender bias, as authorities were more concerned with heresy and demonic pacts than with merely controlling women. The work of H.C. Erich Mittelfohr in Witch Hunting in southwestern Germany, 1562 to 1684, details the religious anxiety of the time. Political instability also contributed. In times of war, famine, or political upheaval, rulers and authorities might use witch trials as a way to assert control, eliminate perceived enemies, or distract the populace from larger societal problems. Accusations could be leveled against anyone seen as undermining authority or disrupting order, regardless of gender. It is crucial to remember that men were also accused of witchcraft. While they were a minority in most places, their numbers were not insignificant. In some regions, like Iceland, men were actually the majority of those accused and executed. These accusations against men often involved different types of magic, such as runic magic for fishing or protective spells, or in some cases political dissent and heresy cloaked in accusations of sorcery. The Trier witch trials of the 1580s provide a stark example where men were accused in significant numbers, including prominent citizens, judges, and even mayors. In this particular wave of trials, men were often targeted for alleged financial dealings with the devil or for practicing forms of learned magic or maleficent magic aimed at specific harms. Similarly, the Basque witch trials in the early 17th century saw entire families accused, including men and children, suggesting that family ties and community dynamics were as important as gender in determining who became a target. The specific accusations against women sometimes touched upon sexuality or reproductive roles, such as causing impotence in men or harming children. But these were often part of a broader set of charges related to causing general misfortune or making a pact with evil. The common stereotype of the witch as an old, ugly woman arose from various cultural and social anxieties, but it did not fully encapsulate the range of individuals who found themselves caught in the witch hunt frenzy. The detailed historical records presented in The European Witch Hunt by Brian Levack show a nuanced picture of victims, not just a simple gender divide. So while misogyny certainly played a role in making women more vulnerable and influencing the nature of some accusations, it was one thread in a much larger and more complex tapestry of factors. To attribute the witch hunt solely to misogyny is to overlook the intricate economic, social, religious, and political forces that converged to create one of the darkest periods in European history. Number 5. Medieval women had no power and were universally oppressed. The idea that medieval women were universally powerless and oppressed, living lives solely defined by their fathers, husbands, or the church is a widely held misconception. While it is true that medieval society was largely patriarchal and opportunities were often constrained by gender norms, women held a surprising variety of roles and exercised different forms of power and influence within their own spheres. The concept of power itself needs to be understood in its historical context, as it looked different from modern notions of political or economic power. In the household, particularly among the nobility and wealthy merchants, women often wielded significant managerial authority. The lady of the manor, while her husband might be away at war or in court, was responsible for managing the entire estate. This included overseeing servants, managing finances, distributing provisions, and ensuring the smooth running of agricultural operations. She was often responsible for the health and education of the children and for maintaining the family's social standing. The letters and household accounts of figures like Agnes Paston, a 15th century English gentrywoman, reveal her assertive and highly competent management of family properties and legal affairs, often making tough decisions in her husband's absence. Within religious institutions, women found unique avenues for power and intellectual life. Abbesses, the heads of convents and monasteries, held immense spiritual and temporal power. They governed large communities of women, managed extensive lands, acted as feudal lords, and sometimes even had jurisdiction over villages and their inhabitants. Some abbesses advised kings and popes, conducted diplomatic missions, and were powerful patrons of the arts and learning. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, is a shining example. She was a visionary, composer, philosopher, mystic, and writer whose counsel was sought by emperors, popes, and high-ranking clergy across Europe. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of her convent. In urban centers, women participated actively in the economy. While some guilds excluded women, many others, particularly those involved in textiles, brewing, baking, and food production, welcomed female members. Women ran workshops, managed businesses, and trained apprentices. Widows, in particular, often inherited their husbands' businesses and continued to run them successfully. City records from places like London, Paris, and Florence show numerous instances of women working as independent merchants, artisans, and shopkeepers. The wives of burgesses were often involved in their husbands' trades and sometimes practiced their own. Royal and noble women could exert significant political influence. Queens acted as regents for their underage sons, effectively ruling kingdoms during their regencies. They engaged in diplomacy, arranged marriages, and sometimes even commanded armies. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a 12th century figure, serves as a powerful testament to this. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, participated in a crusade, and was a major patron of troubadour poetry and courtly love. Her political maneuvering and personal agency shaped the destinies of two major European powers. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, was an exceptionally capable regent who suppressed baronial revolts and secured her son's throne. Even among peasant women, while their lives were undoubtedly challenging and physically demanding, they were indispensable to the agricultural economy. They worked in the fields alongside men, managed household chores, raised children, and contributed significantly to the family's survival. Their labor was vital, giving them a form of practical, if not formal, power within the household and community. The Domesday Book from 1086, a detailed survey of land holdings in England, records instances of women holding land in their own right, demonstrating their property rights in certain circumstances. Literary women, though fewer in number, also carved out influential positions. Christine de Pizan, writing in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, was a professional author who actively challenged misogynistic views prevalent in her society. Her work, The Book of the City of Ladies, defended women and argued for their intellectual capabilities and moral worth. She was a highly respected intellectual figure who earned her living through her writing, a remarkable feat for a woman of her time. Historian Eileen Power's Medieval People includes essays that shed light on the varied experiences and influence of medieval women across different social strata. While medieval society placed legal and social limitations on women and their lives were certainly different from those of men, to claim they were universally powerless and oppressed ignores the rich diversity of their experiences and the different forms of agency they exercised. Their power might not always have been overt political power, but it was real, significant, and varied across class, region, and individual circumstances. Number 4, witchcraft was an organized satanic religion. The thrilling image of witches gathering in secret covens, performing dark rituals, making pacts with the devil, and flying to nighttime sabbats is a pervasive one, often assumed to be the core belief about witchcraft in the medieval period. However, this elaborate picture of an organized satanic religion was largely a creation of theologians, inquisitors, and later legal scholars during the late medieval and early modern periods, rather than a reflection of common folk belief or an actual existing secret cult. For most of the medieval period, witchcraft was primarily understood as maleficium, which simply means doing harm through magical means. This involved individual acts like causing sickness in people or animals, blighting crops, or spoiling food, often out of malice or envy towards a neighbor. These were perceived as harmful acts, sometimes involving charms or curses, but they were not typically linked to an organized religion or a grand conspiracy with the devil. Such practices were often seen as sinful superstitions or minor deviations from Christian piety, rather than as allegiance to a demonic cult. Early medieval penitentials, which were handbooks for confessors, rarely mention organized witch cults. They focus instead on individual acts of divination, fortune-telling, or using pagan charms, condemning them as foolish or superstitious, not as part of a widespread satanic conspiracy. The idea of a formal pact with the devil, renouncing Christianity, swearing allegiance to Satan, and engaging in ritualistic desecration of sacred objects evolved slowly. It was not a widely held belief among common people throughout the medieval period. This concept became more prominent in learned circles, particularly among theologians and demonologists who were trying to make sense of evil and heresies through a coherent theological framework. They began to interpret individual instances of perceived harmful magic as evidence of a deeper, more insidious plot orchestrated by the devil himself. This intellectual development was often driven by fear of heresy and a desire to categorize and condemn all forms of religious deviation. The book Europe's Inner Demons by Norman Cohn meticulously traces how this concept of an organized witch cult was largely a scholarly fabrication, born from pre-existing theories about heretical groups and their supposed secret rites. The first significant case in which many of these elements, a demonic familiar ritualistic magic, and an alleged plot appeared was the trial of Dame Alice Kyteler in Ireland in 1324. She was accused of practicing sorcery, consulting with a demonic familiar, and even having sexual relations with demons. However, even in this sensational case, it was largely an isolated incident, driven by local political and ecclesiastical rivalries, and it did not immediately spark a continent-wide panic about an organized satanic cult. The concept of the Sabbat, a nocturnal meeting of witches where they worshipped the devil, feasted, and engaged in illicit acts, also developed gradually. It was often a narrative that emerged from the interrogations themselves, as inquisitors and torturers pressed accused individuals for details that fit their own preconceived notions of what witchcraft involved. The historical evidence shows that many accused individuals, even under torture, had no knowledge of such concepts as satanic pacts or sabbats. Their confessions, when extracted, would often incorporate details that reflected the interrogator's beliefs rather than any actual practice. People would confess to flying through the air or meeting the devil because these were the things their tormentors wanted to hear, not because they were part of an actual secret religious organization. The idea of witchcraft as a coherent, organized religion was therefore an intellectual construct applied to often disparate and individual acts of perceived harmful magic. Instead of an organized religion, medieval society was diverse in its magical beliefs. People believed in various forms of magic, from protective charms and healing spells to curses and divination. These were often rooted in folk traditions, local customs, and ancient pagan remnants, but they were generally understood as individual practices, often passed down through families, rather than elements of a unified anti-Christian religion. The Church condemned these practices as superstitious or sinful, but the leap to an organized, devil-worshipping cult was a later theological development, driven by anxieties about heresy and the perceived power of the devil. Therefore, the belief that witchcraft wasn't organized, satanic religion was largely a theoretical framework developed by authorities seeking to explain perceived evil through a grand, coherent narrative. It was imposed upon individuals who were accused of harmful magic, and it became a powerful tool for persecution, but it did not reflect an actual widespread structured underground religion in the medieval period. Historian Richard Kieckhefer's Magic in the Middle Ages explores the distinctions between learned magic, popular magic, and what later became understood as diabolical witchcraft, clarifying that an organized satanic religion was not a core medieval belief. Number 3. The medieval period saw millions of witches burned at the stake. The image of countless women, and some men, being led to the stake and consumed by flames for the crime of witchcraft is a powerful one, often associated with the medieval period. While the witch hunts were indeed a dark and horrific chapter in European history, the popular notion that millions were burned at the stake during the medieval era is a significant exaggeration. The actual numbers, while still tragic, are far lower, and the peak of these executions occurred in a later historical period. Firstly, the most intense period of witch hunting did not strictly fall within the medieval period, which generally concludes around the late 15th century. The peak of witch trials and executions actually occurred in the early modern period, roughly from 1450 to 1750, with the most intense surges happening between the late 16th and mid 17th centuries. This means that the majority of witch executions took place after the traditional end of the Middle Ages. So, while some trials certainly happened in the late medieval period, the widespread phenomenon we associate with witch hunts truly escalated in the centuries that followed. Secondly, the number of executions, while considerable, is often wildly inflated in popular narratives. Modern historical scholarship, which relies on meticulous research of surviving court records, legal documents, and regional archives, estimates the total number of judicial executions for witchcraft across Europe over several centuries to be somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000. This is a chilling figure representing immense human suffering, but it is a far cry from millions. Historians like Brian Levack in The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe provide detailed statistical analyses based on extensive archival research, which consistently point to these much lower, albeit still devastating, numbers. Moreover, the method of execution varied significantly by region. While burning at the stake is the most commonly imagined fate for accused witches, it was not the universal method. Burning was indeed common in continental Europe, particularly in areas where witchcraft was prosecuted as a form of heresy, and heresy was traditionally punishable by fire. The symbolic purification by fire was meant to cleanse the land of a perceived diabolical taint. However, in England, almost all executions for witchcraft were by hanging, not burning. The English legal system did not typically view witchcraft as heresy, but rather as a felony or a form of maleficium harmful magic. As such, it was punished in the same way as other felonies, like murder or theft, which typically meant hanging. In other regions, like Scotland, accused witches were often strangled before their bodies were then burned. Other methods included beheading or drowning, depending on local legal traditions and specific accusations. For example, during the trials in Rottenburg in the 17th century, accused witches were sometimes beheaded before being burned. These details highlight that the image of universal burning is an oversimplification. The intensity of witch trials also varied greatly by region and time. Some areas experienced intense localized outbreaks of trials, sometimes called witch panics, where dozens or even hundreds of people might be accused and executed in a short period. For instance, the Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg in the Holy Roman Empire saw an incredibly intense wave of trials in the early 17th century, where hundreds were executed, including children. Similarly, some communities in Germany and France experienced devastating purges. But these localized surges were not representative of continuous, continent-wide mass executions. Many areas experienced very few, if any, witch trials. Furthermore, not every accusation led to an execution. Many individuals accused of witchcraft were acquitted, others might have been imprisoned, banished, or fined. Some died in prison before their trials could conclude. The legal processes, even in their flawed and brutal forms, sometimes allowed for defense or for skepticism among judges, especially in later periods. The detailed studies of regions like Essex in England by Alan McFarlane in Witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England reveal that while many were accused, only a fraction were actually executed. Thus, while the witch hunts represent a truly dark and destructive period, fueled by fear, superstition, and complex socio-religious factors, the idea of millions of witches being burned at the stake throughout the medieval period is a dramatic overstatement. The reality, though, still horrifying, is more nuanced in terms of numbers, chronology, and methods of execution. Number 2, witches were always old, ugly hags. The enduring image of a witch often features an old woman, bent and gnarled, with a wart on her nose and a sinister cackle, perhaps stirring a cauldron or riding a broomstick. This stereotype of the old hag has been deeply ingrained in popular culture for centuries. While it is true that many older women, particularly those who were poor, widowed, or marginalized, were indeed vulnerable targets for accusations of witchcraft, the historical records reveal a much more diverse picture of those who found themselves accused. Witches were not always old, ugly hags. They came from various age groups, social backgrounds, and even genders. Accusations of witchcraft were often rooted in local disputes, envy, or fear of misfortune. Anyone who was seen as an outsider, troublesome, or simply the object of a neighbor's suspicion could become a target. While an old woman living alone might fit this profile, so too could a younger woman perceived as too attractive, too independent, or someone whose healing remedies sometimes failed. Midwives, for instance, were sometimes accused, not because they were old and ugly, but because their work placed them at the crossroads of life and death, and if a birth went wrong or a child died, they might be blamed. Consider the demographics of the accused. While women certainly constituted the majority of those accused, around 75 to 80%, they were not exclusively old. Court records frequently describe young women, and even children, being accused. The famous Pendle Witches trial in England in 1612, for example, involved a large family group, including young women like Alison Device and Janet Device, who was only about 9 years old when she gave testimony against her own family members. Janet's testimony, even from a child, was taken seriously and contributed to the condemnation of her relatives. This highlights that age was not an absolute barrier to accusation. The Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts in the late 17th century, though taking place after the medieval period, provide another clear illustration. While some older women like Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey were accused, many of the primary accusers were young girls, and some of the accused were also relatively young, such as Bridget Bishop, who was around 60 but not necessarily depicted as a hag, or even young children who were implicated in the frenzy. The trials were sparked by the afflictions of teenage girls, and their accusations were believed and acted upon. Accused witches were not necessarily from the very bottom of society either. While poverty and marginalization increased vulnerability, people from various social strata, including prosperous farmers, merchants, and even clergy members, were sometimes accused, particularly during large-scale witch panics. The witch hunts in Trier, Germany, in the 1580s saw hundreds of people executed, including wealthy citizens, officials, and even children. This suggests that the societal anxieties and mechanisms of accusation could reach beyond the stereotype of the isolated, impoverished old woman. The records from the trial of Walpurga Hausmannen in Dillingen, Germany in 1587 describe a woman who was a midwife but was accused of infanticide and witchcraft, not primarily because of her appearance. Furthermore, men were also accused of witchcraft, sometimes in significant numbers, as noted in the previous myth. These men, obviously, did not fit the old hag stereotype. Their accusations often stemmed from different kinds of perceived harm, such as political dissent or specific forms of learned magic. The ugly hag stereotype likely developed over time through a combination of factors: cultural narratives, folklore, and the way artists and writers depicted witches. It became a convenient visual shorthand for evil and danger. However, to accept this stereotype as the historical reality of every accused witch would be to ignore the complex and diverse experiences of the thousands of individuals who faced accusations and trials for witchcraft. The historical records, meticulously detailed by scholars like Robert Darnton in The Great Cat Massacre and other episodes in French cultural history, show the many faces of suspicion and accusation, not just the single popular image. Number 1. Medieval people believed in magic as science. It is a common misunderstanding to think that medieval people viewed magic, particularly harmful magic or sorcery, as an equivalent to science or a legitimate form of knowledge. While the medieval worldview certainly embraced beliefs in supernatural forces and divine intervention, there was a clear and often rigid distinction drawn between natural philosophy, their equivalent of what we call science, divine miracles, and illicit magical practices. Their magic was generally regarded with suspicion, fear, and strong condemnation, not as a valid pathway to understanding or manipulating the natural world in the way that natural philosophy or theology were. Natural philosophy in the medieval period sought to understand the world through observation, reason, and logical deduction, all within a framework that recognized God as the ultimate creator and sustainer of the universe. The scholars like Thomas Aquinas, a towering intellectual figure of the 13th century, spent vast amounts of time classifying and explaining natural phenomena, from the movements of the planets to the properties of animals and plants. His extensive writings, such as Summa Theologica, clearly distinguish between the natural order, God's direct interventions, miracles, and the illicit use of occult forces, which he attributed to demonic influence. For Aquinas and many other thinkers, magic that involved pacts with demons or evoked spirits was inherently evil and sinful, a perversion of natural order, not a form of knowledge. Divine miracles were seen as direct interventions by God, acts that suspended or transcended the natural laws he himself had established. These were revered and considered evidence of God's power and benevolence. For instance, the healing of a sick person through prayer or the intervention of a saint was understood as a miracle, entirely distinct from a magical spell or charm. There was no confusion between a saintly miracle and what was deemed black magic. Magic, especially maleficium, was understood as manipulating natural or supernatural forces through illicit means, often involving forbidden knowledge, the use of charms, or invoking spirits, which was commonly believed to involve pacts with demons. This was generally viewed as dangerous, heretical, and a grave sin. The church councils throughout the medieval period consistently condemned practices like divination, necromancy, communicating with the dead, and the creation of harmful charms. These condemnations were not because magic was seen as a legitimate, albeit alternative, science, but precisely because it was viewed as a dangerous deviation from Christian doctrine, potentially leading to damnation. Consider Bartholomew the Englishman, a 13th century Franciscan friar who wrote De Proprietatibus Rerum, On the Properties of Things, a widely read medieval encyclopedia. In this massive work, Bartholomew meticulously described the natural world, from astronomy to zoology, listing the inherent properties and uses of plants, animals, and minerals. His approach was systematic and observational, reflecting the natural philosophy of his time. When he mentioned practices that touched on what might be considered magic, he typically distinguished them from legitimate knowledge, often dismissing them as superstitions or, if they involved demonic invocation, condemning them as evil. There was a clear demarcation in his mind between the natural order and attempts to manipulate it illicitly. Alchemists and astrologers occupied a liminal space. For alchemy, the pursuit of transmuting base metals into gold or finding an elixir of life was often seen as a legitimate pursuit of natural philosophy, albeit one that could stray into forbidden territory if it involved demonic aid. Astrology, the study of celestial bodies to predict earthly events, was also widely practiced. While some condemned it as a deterministic art that challenged free will, many scholars saw it as a legitimate, if imperfect, way to understand God's grand design for the universe. However, even these practices were carefully distinguished from dark, or diabolical magic by many medieval scholars and theologians. For example, a court would prosecute a man for forbidden arts if he used astrology to cause harm, but not if he simply cast a horoscope for a wealthy patron, demonstrating the nuance. The legal systems of the time prosecuted magic as a crime, often linking it to heresy, treason, or specific acts of harm. This was distinct from how they treated other forms of knowledge or practice. If a medical doctor's treatment failed, it was seen as a medical error. If a magician's spell was perceived to cause harm, it was seen as a crime often associated with a demonic pact. This difference in treatment highlights the fundamental distinction medieval people made between what they understood as science or natural knowledge and what they understood as magic. The detailed exploration of these distinctions by Owen Davies and Grimoires, A History of Magic books, illustrates the careful categorization of knowledge in medieval times. Therefore, medieval people did not believe in magic as a form of science. Instead, they saw it as a different, often condemned, category of activity that could involve the manipulation of forces beyond human control, often with demonic assistance and almost always with negative moral and spiritual implications.